The Whispering Woods. The Appalachian Trail is a place of serenity and beauty, stretching over 2,000 miles through the eastern United States. It draws hikers from all over the world seeking peace, challenge, and an escape from the chaos of modern life. But the trail holds secrets, dark, ancient secrets that are whispered among locals but rarely believed by outsiders. Katie, a seasoned hiker, had always dreamt of conquering the entire trail. She had spent months preparing, mapping out her route, and gathering supplies. By the time she set out in early September, the trail was with most summer hikers already gone. The crisp autumn air was perfect, and Katie relished the solitude. She started her journey in Georgia with plans to hike northward to Maine. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the usual beauty of the Appalachian woods. The golden leaves, the distant sound of rivers, and the occasional deer sightings made for an idyllic start. But as she ventured deeper into the trail, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with the feeling of being watched. Katie dismissed it as paranoia. After all, she was alone in the wilderness, and her mind was bound to play tricks on her. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. She began to notice strange things. Branches snapped in the distance, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind, and, most unsettling of all, the faint sound of whispering. One evening, as she set up camp near an old abandoned shelter, she heard it clearly for the first time. A soft, barely audible whisper that seemed to come from the trees themselves. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. Goosebumps prickled her skin, and she found herself scanning the darkening forest for any sign of life. There was nothing. Katie tried to brush it off as a trick of the wind or her imagination running wild. But that night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the whispering seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It wasn't long before she realized it wasn't just random noise, there was a rhythm to it, a pattern. The next morning, she decided to push on, trying to put as much distance between herself and the strange shelter as possible. But the whispering followed her. No matter how fast or far she hiked, it was always there, just at the edge of hearing. She began to feel a growing sense of dread, as if the forest itself was trying to warn her of something. On the fifth day, exhausted and unnerved, Katie came across a small, isolated cabin that wasn't marked on her map. It was old and weathered, with vines creeping up its sides and a sagging roof. Desperate for a break from the constant feeling of being watched, she decided to investigate. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty, with cobwebs hanging from the corners. There was a single broken chair in the center of the room and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. But what caught her attention was a crude carving on the far wall. It was a symbol, scratched deeply into the wood, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. As she stared at the symbol, the whispering grew louder, filling the small cabin with an eerie chant. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew she had to get out. She bolted out of the cabin, her mind racing. The whispering followed her, growing louder with every step. It was no longer just background noise, it was a chorus of voices, all chanting in unison. The forest around her seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at her as she ran. Katie didn't stop until she reached a clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering had subsided, but she could still feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of the woods. She collapsed onto the ground, trying to calm her racing heart. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she knew she was in danger. As she sat there, trying to make sense of everything, she noticed something strange about the clearing. The grass was dead and brittle, and the trees surrounding it were gnarled and twisted, their branches bare despite the season. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, its surface etched with the same symbol she had seen in the cabin. A cold wave of fear washed over her as she realized the stone wasn't just a part of the landscape, it was an altar. Suddenly the whispering returned, louder and more frenzied than ever. The voices seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her, trapping her. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The ground beneath her began to tremble, and she could feel a dark presence rising from the earth. Katie tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the whispering reached a deafening crescendo. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and she could feel something ancient and malevolent, drawing closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. Katie stood in the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest, the silence more terrifying than the noise. She looked around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the dead grass, the twisted trees, and the altar. She took a step back, and that's when she saw it. A shadow, moving across the ground, heading straight for her. It was shapeless, amorphous, but it radiated a malevolence that made her blood run cold. She turned to run, but the shadow moved faster, engulfing her in darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but cold, suffocating blackness. And then the whispering returned, but this time it was inside her head. 2 weeks later, a search party found Katie's campsite, abandoned and undisturbed. Her belongings were scattered around, but there was no sign of her. The only clue was a series of strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the site. Circles with intersecting lines etched deep into the bark. They never found her body. Locals say that the Appalachian Trail has always been haunted, that the forest holds secrets older than time itself. And sometimes those who venture too far into the woods hear the whispers, voices calling them deeper into the darkness, never to return. The Hollow Man. The Appalachian Trail had always been a place of escape for Olivia. After her divorce, the trail became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in nature and leave the pain of her past behind. This time she had planned a week-long solo hike through a remote section of the trail, far from any towns or popular campsites. It was exactly what she needed, a week of solitude, just her and the wilderness. The first few days were blissful. The weather was perfect, the trail quiet, and the scenery breathtaking. She felt the tension in her shoulders slowly ease as the miles passed under her boots. The dense canopy above her filtered the sunlight into a soft, golden glow, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. On the fourth day, Olivia decided to take a detour from the main trail. She had found an old map in a ranger station that showed a forgotten side path leading to a secluded valley. It wasn't marked on any of the modern maps, and she was excited at the thought of discovering a hidden gem. The side trail was narrow and overgrown, clearly unused for years. Branches reached out like skeletal fingers, scratching at her arms and face as she pushed through. The deeper she went, the thicker the forest became. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and gnarled, and the undergrowth became dense and tangled. After what felt like hours, she finally emerged into the valley. It was a small, enclosed space, surrounded on all sides by steep, rocky hills. A stream ran through the center, its water clear and cold. The air was cooler here, with a slight mist hanging low to the ground. Despite the isolation, the place had a strange beauty to it, and Olivia felt a sense of accomplishment at having found it. She set up her tent near the stream and spent the rest of the day exploring the valley. There were no signs that anyone had been there in a long time. The forest floor was thick with moss, and the trees towered above, their branches forming a nearly impenetrable canopy. As evening approached, she built a small fire and cooked her dinner, enjoying the peaceful silence that enveloped the valley. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere began to change. The mist grew thicker, clinging to the ground like a living thing, and the air grew unnaturally cold. The trees, which had seemed so majestic during the day, now loomed over her like silent sentinels. A sense of unease settled over Olivia, and she found herself glancing around, expecting to see something, though she wasn't sure what, emerging from the shadows. It was then that she noticed the sound. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like the wind moving through the leaves, but there was no wind. The air was still, the mist hanging heavy in the valley. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a slow, deliberate shuffling, like something was moving through the underbrush. Olivia's heart began to race. She stood up, straining her ears to pinpoint the source of the noise. It seemed to be coming from all around her, as if the entire forest was alive and moving. She grabbed her flashlight and swept it across the trees, but the beam was swallowed by the mist. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. The shuffling grew closer, and she realized with a jolt of fear that it wasn't just one sound, but many. It was as if the entire forest was closing in on her. She backed up towards her tent, her mind racing. She tried to convince herself that it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons, but deep down she knew it was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. She held her breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the mist, standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow pits of darkness. It stood there, motionless, watching her. Olivia felt a scream rising in her throat, but it caught there, strangled by fear. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing that was watching her. The figure took a step forward, and then another, its movements jerky and unnatural like a puppet on strings. As it approached, she saw that its mouth was sewn shut, thick black thread crisscrossing over cracked, dry lips. Despite this, she could hear a faint whispering, like a voice carried on the wind. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was filled with malice. The figure took another step, and Olivia finally found the strength to move. She turned and bolted towards her tent. But before she could reach it, she felt a cold, bony hand wrap around her wrist. She looked back, and the figure was right behind her, its hollow eyes boring into hers. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel it in her mind, like it was trying to dig its way into her thoughts. In a blind panic, Olivia ripped her hand free and ran, leaving her tent, her gear, everything behind. She didn't stop running until she was back on the main trail, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She collapsed to the ground, shaking uncontrollably, her mind reeling from what she had just seen. For the rest of the night, she huddled by the side of the trail, too terrified to move. The whispering had stopped, but she could still feel the figure's presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, she forced herself to her feet and started walking. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town, her body exhausted and her mind numb. She told herself that it had been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear, but deep down she knew the truth. The figure had been real, and it was still out there in the valley, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stray from the path. A month later, another hiker found Olivia's abandoned campsite in the valley. Her tent was still there, along with her gear, but there was no sign of her. The hiker reported the find to the rangers, who conducted a search of the area. They found no trace of Olivia, but they did find something else. Deep in the valley, etched into the stone of the stream bed, were dozens of symbols, all identical to the one that had been sewn into the figure's mouth. The locals called it the Hollow Man, an old legend whispered among the mountain folk, a creature that could steal the souls of those who wandered too far into the woods. Olivia had become just another lost soul, claimed by the Hollow Man, never to return. The echoes of Blackwood Ridge. Blackwood Ridge was a notorious stretch of the Appalachian Trail, one that seasoned hikers avoided. It was steeped in local legend, with stories of disappearances and ghostly sightings passed down through generations. But like all tales, there were those who dismissed them as mere folklore, including Matt and Jenna, an adventurous couple eager to experience the trail's untamed beauty. They had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for several days, enjoying the solitude and the thrill of nature. Matt, a photographer, was particularly excited about Blackwood Ridge. The area was rumored to be stunning, with views that few hikers had ever captured on film. Jenna, though more cautious, trusted Matt's instincts and was curious to see if the stories held any truth. As they approached the ridge, the forest grew denser, the trees taller, and the air thicker. A strange stillness settled over the area, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Despite the unease that gnawed at her, Jenna pushed forward, following Matt up the steep incline. "Just think of the photos we'll get," Matt said, grinning as he wiped sweat from his brow. "No one's documented this place properly in years." Jenna nodded, though her eyes kept darting to the shadows between the trees. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The trail was narrow, winding through dense underbrush that clawed at their legs as they walked. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. The view was indeed breathtaking, a vast expanse of forest stretching as far as the eye could see, with the distant peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains visible on the horizon. But the beauty of the scene was marred by a strange, pervasive sense of wrongness. Matt set up his camera, snapping photos of the ridge and the valley below. Jenna wandered a little farther along the trail, her footsteps echoing oddly in the stillness. It was as if the very air was heavy with tension, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. As she walked, she noticed something strange about the trees around them. Their bark was dark, almost black, and their branches twisted and gnarled, resembling skeletal limbs reaching out towards the sky. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches, and the deeper she went into the woods, the darker it became. "Matt, do you feel that?" She called back, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Feel what?" he replied, not looking up from his camera. Jenna hesitated. She wasn't sure how to describe the feeling, the oppressive stillness, the way the shadows seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. It was as if the forest was watching them, waiting. "Never mind," she muttered, turning to head back to Matt. But as she did, she froze. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, she saw a figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still among the trees. His face was obscured by shadow, but she could feel his gaze on her, cold and unblinking. A chill ran down her spine, and she took an involuntary step back. "Matt," she called again, her voice trembling slightly. "There's someone out there." Matt finally looked up, following her gaze. "Where?" Jenna pointed towards the figure, but as soon as she did, it was gone. The trees stood silent and unmoving, as if nothing had been there at all. "Are you sure?" Matt asked, his brow furrowing. "I saw him, Matt. He was right there." Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, the uneasy feeling growing stronger. Maybe it was just another hiker. "It's getting late, though. We should set up camp before it gets dark." Reluctantly, Jenna agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. They found a small clearing just off the trail and pitched their tent. As night fell, the forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness thick and impenetrable. They ate a quick meal by the light of their campfire, but the usual comfort of the flames did little to ease Jenna's nerves. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Matt, ever the skeptic, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe the guy you saw was the Blackwood Ridge ghost," he joked, grinning at her, "here to scare off anyone who dares to set foot on his land." Jenna forced a smile, but the unease gnawing at her wouldn't go away. As they settled into their tent for the night, she couldn't help but feel that they were being watched. She woke in the middle of the night to a faint sound, like distant whispers carried on the wind. At first she thought it was just the breeze rustling the leaves, but then she heard it again, a low, murmuring voice, just outside the tent. "Matt," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Matt groaned, half asleep. "What is it? Listen." They both fell silent, and there it was again, the whispering, closer now, almost at the edge of the tent. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the voice wasn't speaking in any language she recognized. It was a harsh, guttural sound, like someone trying to speak with a throat full of gravel. Matt sat up, his expression finally serious. He grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping outside. Jenna followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light over the clearing. The forest was still, the trees looming like dark sentinels. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. "Hello?" Matt called out, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Is anyone there?" The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but twisted branches and thick underbrush. But as the beam moved across the forest, Jenna caught a glimpse of something, a shadow darting between the trees. She grabbed Matt's arm, pointing towards it. "There!" Matt turned the flashlight in the direction she was pointing, but the shadow was gone. He frowned, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Stay here," he said, and before Jenna could protest, he started towards the trees. "Matt! Wait!" Jenna hissed, fear gripping her. But he ignored her, disappearing into the darkness. She stood there, trembling, the silence pressing in on her. The minutes stretched on, and Matt didn't return. The whispering started again, closer this time, circling the clearing like a malevolent wind. Jenna's fear turned to panic. She ran towards the trees, calling Matt's name, but there was no response. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and warping as she moved deeper into the woods. And then she saw it, the figure from earlier, standing just ahead, half hidden in the shadows. But this time there was something different. The figure was closer, and she could make out more details. The tattered clothes, the unnaturally long limbs, and the hollow, empty eyes that stared at her with a cold, malevolent hunger. She turned to run, but it was too late. The figure moved faster than she could comprehend, closing the distance in an instant. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and then everything went black. When Jenna opened her eyes, she was back in the clearing, lying on the ground. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. She sat up, her head pounding, her body aching. Matt was nowhere to be seen. She called his name, her voice hoarse and desperate, but there was no answer. The tent was still there, the fire long dead, but all of Matt's gear was gone. It was as if he had never been there at all. Shaking with fear and confusion, Jenna stumbled back to the main trail. She didn't stop until she reached a ranger station several miles away, her mind reeling from the events of the night. The rangers organized a search, but they found no trace of Matt. His disappearance was just another in a long line of mysteries surrounding Blackwood Ridge. The only clue they found was Jenna's camera, left behind in the clearing. When they developed the film, the last photo taken was of the ridge at sunset, with a shadowy figure barely visible among the trees. The locals whispered of the echoes of Blackwood Ridge, a curse that befell those who ventured too far into its depths. They said the forest was alive, feeding off the souls of those who dared to disturb it, trapping them in its twisted embrace. Jenna never returned to the trail. The memory of that night haunted her for the rest of her life, the whispering voices and the hollow-eyed figure forever etched into her mind. Blackwood Ridge remained a place of mystery and fear, a stretch of the Appalachian Trail that few dared to tread. For those who did, the echoes would always follow, whispering of lost souls and forgotten dreams, forever trapped in the darkness of the ridge. The specter of Raven's Hollow. Tucked away in the remotest part of the Appalachian Trail, Raven's Hollow was a place few dared to enter. The locals warned hikers to stay away, speaking in hushed tones of the cursed hollow where the trees grew too close together, their branches intertwining like bony fingers, blotting out the sky. But for Ethan and Sarah, seasoned hikers and thrill-seekers, such tales were nothing more than exaggerated folklore. They were determined to conquer Raven's Hollow, to prove that it was just another stretch of trail. The couple set out early one misty morning, their backpacks heavy with supplies. The sky was overcast, casting the world in shades of gray. The dense fog that rolled off the mountains seemed almost alive, swirling around them as they hiked, muffling the sounds of the forest. Despite the foreboding atmosphere, Ethan was excited. "This is going to be epic," he said, snapping pictures of the mist-laden trees with his phone. "We'll have stories to tell for years." Sarah smiled, though she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her stomach as soon as they had stepped onto the trail. The woods were unnaturally silent, and the fog clung to the ground like a shroud, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The trail narrowed as they moved deeper into the hollow, the trees growing taller and thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The ground underfoot was soft and damp, as if the earth itself was sick. Sarah glanced around, noting the lack of wildlife, no birds, no insects, nothing. Just the endless stretch of trees and the oppressive silence. After several hours of hiking, they reached the heart of Raven's Hollow. The trees here were ancient, their roots snaking across the ground in tangled knots. A small clearing lay ahead, with a massive oak tree standing at its center. Its bark was blackened and cracked, as if it had been struck by lightning, yet it still stood tall and imposing. "This must be it," Ethan said, his voice tinged with awe. He walked towards the tree, pulling out his camera. "The famous Raven's Oak. They say it's over 1,000 years old." Sarah hung back, her unease growing stronger. There was something about the tree that unsettled her. It felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. She could almost hear a faint humming, like the distant sound of chanting carried on the wind. Ethan circled the tree, snapping photos from every angle. "Come on, Sarah. You've got to see this. The bark has these weird markings, almost like..." His voice trailed off abruptly, and Sarah looked up to see him staring at the base of the tree. She walked over, her heart pounding, and saw what had silenced him. Carved into the blackened bark were dozens of symbols, jagged and crude, yet somehow ancient. They spiraled around the trunk, converging at the base where the roots dug deep into the earth. But it wasn't just the symbols that unnerved her. It was the small, shallow graves that surrounded the tree, each marked with a simple stone. "Who would bury something out here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan knelt by one of the graves, brushing away the leaves and dirt. "These don't look recent," he said, frowning. "Maybe it's a pet cemetery or something." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The graves were too small, too precise, and the air around them felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 secrets pressing down on her. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as the fog thickened, swirling around the tree in a slow, deliberate dance. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I don't like this place." Ethan, sensing her unease, nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, maybe you're right. This is getting kind of creepy." They turned to leave, but as they did, the fog seemed to close in around them, thickening into an impenetrable wall. The path they had come down was gone, swallowed by the mist. The trees, which had stood silent and still, now seemed to shift and twist, their branches creaking as if they were alive. Sarah's heart raced as she grabbed Ethan's hand. "What's happening?" "I don't know," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Just stay close. We'll find the trail." But no matter which direction they turned, the mist only grew thicker, and the trees seemed to move, their branches reaching out like claws. The strange humming grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was chanting, calling them deeper into its grasp. Panic set in as they stumbled through the fog, disoriented and terrified. The symbols on the trees seemed to burn in Sarah's mind, their jagged lines searing into her thoughts. She could feel the weight of countless eyes watching them, unseen but ever present, and the graves at the base of the tree loomed large in her mind. What if they weren't graves? What if they were something worse? Suddenly, Ethan stopped short, his grip tightening on Sarah's hand. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Sarah listened, her breath catching in her throat. At first she heard nothing but the pounding of her own heart, but then, from somewhere deep within the fog, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to move. Now." They turned and ran, but the footsteps followed, keeping pace with them. The humming grew louder, almost deafening now, and the air seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. The mist parted briefly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of a figure, a tall, shadowy shape, its features obscured by the fog. "Ethan, run!" She screamed, but as she turned to grab his hand, she realized he was no longer beside her. She stopped, frantically looking around. "Ethan, where are you?" But there was no response, only the echo of her own voice. The fog swirled around her, thick and suffocating, and she felt the cold fingers of fear tighten around her heart. The footsteps were closer now, almost upon her, and the figure in the mist loomed large, its shadow stretching across the ground. Desperation drove her forward, but no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the mist or the figures that danced at the edges of her vision. The forest had become a labyrinth, twisting and turning, leading her deeper into its heart. Finally, exhausted and terrified, she stumbled back into the clearing. The massive oak tree stood before her, its blackened bark glowing faintly in the dim light. The graves seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the humming was now a full-throated chant, echoing in her mind. And then she saw him, Ethan, standing at the base of the tree, his back to her. Relief flooded through her, and she ran to him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. "Ethan," she cried, reaching out to him. But as he turned, the relief turned to horror. His eyes were vacant, hollow, and his face was pale, almost translucent. The symbols from the tree were etched into his skin, glowing with a sickly light. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only the same guttural humming that had haunted her since they entered Raven's Hollow. Sarah stumbled back, her mind reeling with terror. This wasn't Ethan. This was something else, something wearing his skin. She turned to run, but the mist closed in around her, suffocating, impenetrable. The last thing she saw was the massive oak tree, its branches reaching down like the arms of a great dark specter, ready to pull her into the earth. A week later, a search party found their abandoned campsite at the edge of Raven's Hollow. Their gear was untouched, but there was no sign of Ethan or Sarah. The locals shook their heads, adding the couple's names to the long list of those who had disappeared in the hollow, never to be seen again. Some say that if you stand at the edge of Raven's Hollow at dusk, you can still hear the faint humming carried on the wind. And if you're brave enough to venture into the hollow itself, you might catch a glimpse of two shadowy figures among the trees, forever lost, their souls claimed by the ancient curse that haunts Raven's Hollow. But be warned, those who see them rarely return, for the hollow is always hungry, and it never lets go of those who stray too far into its depths. The Lantern Man of Widow's Peak. The Appalachian Trail, with its endless stretches of wilderness and solitude, was a haven for those seeking escape from the bustle of everyday life. But there were places along the trail that even the most seasoned hikers avoided. Places like Widow's Peak. Widow's Peak was a rugged outcrop of rock that jutted out from the mountainside, overlooking a vast, fog-filled valley. The peak itself was named for the numerous tragedies that had occurred there over the years: accidental falls, lost hikers, and unexplained disappearances. The locals spoke of the place with a mixture of fear and reverence, warning travelers to stay clear, especially after dark. But for Clara and Ben, a pair of outdoor enthusiasts, the stories only added to the allure. They were on a mission to hike every mile of the Appalachian Trail, and they weren't about to let a few ghost stories deter them. It was late afternoon when they reached the base of Widow's Peak. The trail leading up the mountain was narrow and steep, winding through dense woods that seemed to grow darker with each step they took. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sounds were the rustle of the wind through the trees and the crunch of their boots on the gravel path. "Almost there," Ben said, glancing at his map. "We should be able to set up camp near the top. The view is supposed to be incredible." Clara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her as soon as they had entered the woods. The trees here were tall and ancient, their branches twisted and gnarled like the hands of an old crone. The path was littered with rocks and fallen branches, making the climb treacherous. As they ascended, the fog that had been lingering in the valley began to rise, creeping up the mountainside like a living thing. It wrapped around them, thick and cold, muffling the sounds of the forest and reducing their visibility to a few feet. The trail markers became harder to spot, and more than once they found themselves off the path, having to backtrack to find their way. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with worry. Ben hesitated, looking around at the encroaching fog. "I think so. We're close, but this fog is making it tough to see anything." They continued on, the atmosphere growing more oppressive with each step. The trees seemed to press in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes and faces. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, convinced that they were being watched. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged onto a flat, rocky ledge, the summit of Widow's Peak. The fog was even thicker up here, swirling around them like a living, breathing entity. The sun was low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow through the mist. "This is it," Ben said, sounding more uncertain than excited. "We made it." Clara looked around, her unease deepening. The view that Ben had promised was completely obscured by the fog, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The ledge was small, bordered by sheer drops on three sides, with only the narrow trail leading back down the way they had come. "I don't like this, Ben," Clara said, hugging her arms to her chest. "We should have stayed lower on the trail." Ben opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a soft, distant sound reached their ears. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, the sound of a lantern swinging in the wind, its glass panes clinking softly against the metal frame. Clara froze, her blood running cold. "Do you hear that?" Ben nodded, his eyes scanning the fog. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Clara knew better. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and measured, accompanied by the unmistakable clinking of a lantern. It seemed to be coming from the fog itself, moving closer with each passing second. "Ben, we need to get out of here," Clara whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. But before they could move, the fog parted, revealing a tall, shadowy figure emerging from the mist. The figure was clad in old, tattered clothing, its face obscured by the hood of a long, black cloak. In one hand, it held a rusted lantern, its light dim and flickering. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the figure came closer, its footsteps echoing hollowly on the rocky ground. The lantern's light cast long, distorted shadows across the ledge, and the air grew colder with each step the figure took. Ben took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued its slow, deliberate march towards them, the lantern swinging gently in its grasp. As it drew nearer, Clara could see the pale, skeletal hand that held the lantern, the skin stretched tight over bone. Panic surged through her, and she grabbed Ben's arm. "We have to go. Now." But as they turned to flee, the figure spoke. Its voice was low and hollow, like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. "Stay," it said. "Stay and join the others." Clara's blood ran cold as she glanced around the ledge, her eyes widening in horror. The fog had thinned just enough for her to see the edge of the cliff, where the rocks were dotted with small, weathered crosses, makeshift grave markers half buried in the earth. Ben didn't wait to see more. He grabbed Clara's hand and they bolted back down the trail, the sound of the lantern clinking growing fainter behind them. They ran blindly through the fog, the twisted branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The path seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around them, but finally they burst out onto a lower section of the trail, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the way forward. They didn't stop running until they reached the base of the mountain, the shadows of Ashenwood House. Ashenwood House, perched atop a lonely hill in rural Oregon, had always been a source of whispers and uneasy glances among the locals. Once a grand estate, it was now a crumbling shell of its former self, overrun by creeping vines and weathered by time. The house's history was a tapestry of tragedy and mystery, marked by the sudden disappearance of its last owner, Dr. Edwin Ashcroft, and a series of unexplained events that followed. When Julia and Ben, paranormal investigators with a reputation for tackling the most challenging cases, heard about Ashenwood House, they were eager to explore its secrets. Equipped with state-of-the-art gear and a bold determination, they arrived at the house on a misty autumn evening, their breath visible in the crisp air. The house loomed before them, its dark windows like vacant eyes watching their every move. The wooden door, swollen with age, creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, the grand foyer was covered in dust, with old, ornate furniture draped in sheets and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. "This place is perfect," Julia said, her voice echoing in the empty space. "Let's set up and see what we can find." They set up their equipment in the main hall and began their investigation. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of settling wood and the distant sound of the wind howling outside. As they explored, they found peculiar items, a collection of old medical instruments, faded photographs, and an old journal belonging to Dr. Ashcroft. The journal was filled with cryptic entries, detailing Dr. Ashcroft's obsession with the afterlife and the experiments he conducted to communicate with the dead. One entry, written in a hurried scrawl, read, "The shadows in the house grow restless. They whisper secrets, but their voices are distorted. I must find the heart of the house before it's too late." Julia and Ben exchanged uneasy glances. "This is unsettling," Ben said, "but let's see if we can find this heart and figure out what's really going on." They continued their investigation, moving through the rooms with their cameras and recorders. The house seemed to grow colder, and the silence was occasionally broken by faint, echoing whispers. They captured some strange anomalies on their equipment, flickering shadows and unexplained noises, but nothing definitive. At midnight, while reviewing their footage in the library, the temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers grew louder, forming a coherent message. "The heart lies beneath. Find it before the shadows consume you." Julia shivered. We need to find out what this means. They searched the house thoroughly, eventually discovering a hidden staircase behind a false wall in the basement. The stairs descended into darkness, and the air grew colder with each step. The whispers turned into a constant, dissonant hum that seemed to reverberate through the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a large, hidden chamber. The room was filled with old, ritualistic objects, candles, symbols, and an intricately carved wooden box. The box was adorned with strange markings that matched those in Dr. Ashcroft's journal. Ben hesitated before opening it. This could be dangerous. Julia nodded, her hands trembling. We need to know. As they opened the box, they found a small, ornate key and a weathered piece of parchment. The parchment contained a riddle. The heart is where shadows dance, a place of darkness and forgotten chance. As they deciphered the riddle, the chamber's atmosphere grew oppressive. The whispers became frenzied, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift, forming dark shapes that writhed and twisted. Julia noticed a hidden door behind a large, dusty curtain. The door was locked, but the key from the box fit perfectly. With a click, the door opened to reveal a narrow passage leading to a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a pedestal with a heart-shaped object encased in glass. The object seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly light. As Julia and Ben approached, the shadows in the room grew darker and more aggressive. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and an icy wind howled through the passage. The whispers turned into angry screams, and the room was engulfed in darkness. The pedestal began to tremble, and the heart-shaped object glowed brighter. In the pitch black, Julia and Ben felt a cold, malevolent presence closing in on them. They could barely make out the shadows dancing around them, their forms elongated and distorted. Julia reached for the heart-shaped object, hoping it would quell the darkness. As her fingers touched the glass, the shadows recoiled, and a blinding light erupted from the object. The darkness lifted, and the oppressive atmosphere vanished. The room was illuminated by a warm, comforting glow, and the whispers faded into a distant echo. Julia and Ben quickly gathered their equipment and made their way back to the main floor. The mansion seemed to have returned to its eerie but relatively benign state. The oppressive presence was gone, and the shadows no longer writhed with malevolence. As they left the house, they glanced back one last time. The mansion stood silent, its dark reputation seemingly at rest. The heart-shaped object had been returned to its pedestal, its purpose fulfilled. The next morning, the mansion remained quiet. Julia and Ben's footage showed only static and the occasional shadow, but the oppressive whispers and malevolent presence were gone. The heart of Ashenwood House had been discovered and restored, but its secrets remained shrouded in mystery. Ashenwood House stood as a testament to the strange and unsettling, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and the shadows danced with a life of their own. Echoes on the Appalachian. The Appalachian Trail, with its ancient trees and tangled underbrush, was the last place Emily thought she'd find herself. But life had a way of leading her into the dark corners of her fears. She had been hiking alone for weeks, seeking solace in nature after her recent breakup. The tranquility she sought was often shattered by her own restless thoughts, making the hike more of a mental struggle than a physical one. It was a cold October evening when Emily set up camp in a small clearing. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in a veil of eerie twilight. She lit her campfire and sat with her back against a gnarled oak, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep from the very ground. As the fire crackled, the shadows danced around her, making the forest seem alive with unseen eyes. Nightfall came swiftly, and with it, a dense fog rolled in, cloaking the forest in a suffocating haze. The only sound was the occasional snap of a twig and the distant, haunting call of an owl. Emily tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, convincing herself that the forest was simply being its usual self. She was about to settle into her sleeping bag when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic thudding from deep within the forest. At first, she thought it might be the heartbeat of the forest itself, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. It was as if someone or something was walking toward her, step by deliberate step. Emily's breath quickened. She tried to dismiss it as the wind playing tricks, but the thudding continued, growing louder and more insistent. Her heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way toward the source of the noise. The fog had thickened, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As she moved through the mist, the thudding grew clearer, almost as if it were directly in front of her. Emily reached a small, dilapidated cabin she hadn't noticed before. The cabin looked abandoned, with its rotting timbers and shattered windows, but the thudding came from within. Her curiosity battled with her fear, and despite her better judgment, she pushed the creaking door open. The inside of the cabin was eerily silent. Dust and cobwebs clung to the furniture, and a musty smell permeated the air. Emily scanned the room with her flashlight, revealing a few old, broken pieces of furniture and a large, ancient mirror hanging on one wall. The thudding had stopped. She was about to turn and leave when she noticed something odd about the mirror. It seemed to be out of place, as if it didn't belong in the decrepit cabin. The glass was cracked, but through the fractures she could make out something strange, dark, shifting shapes moving behind her reflection. Emily's heart raced. She turned around quickly, but the room was empty. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut, and the temperature in the cabin plummeted. Emily's breath turned to mist as she turned back to the mirror. The shapes were more defined now, dark, shadowy figures that seemed to writhe and twist. One of them appeared to be moving toward her. Desperate to escape, Emily grabbed her flashlight and ran toward the door, but it was stuck fast. Panic surged as she realized she was trapped. She pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the only response was the eerie silence and the relentless thudding, which seemed to be coming from all directions now. Suddenly, the thudding stopped. The room fell into an oppressive silence, and Emily's flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, she heard a whispering voice, a soft, almost tender voice that seemed to come from within the mirror. The words were unintelligible, but they carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. With trembling hands, Emily reached out and touched the mirror. The glass felt unnervingly cold, and as her fingers made contact, the mirror's surface rippled like water. Without warning, she was pulled into the mirror, falling through an icy void. When she landed, she found herself in an identical cabin, but this one was pristine, no dust, no decay. The fog was gone, and the forest outside the window seemed bright and welcoming. Emily looked around in confusion, her fear giving way to bewilderment. As she approached the door, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The door was marked with a familiar symbol, a small carved figure of a person trapped within a mirror, with a date inscribed below it, October 23rd, 1924. It was the same date as today. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the truth. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a trap. Those who entered were doomed to become part of its sinister history, each trapped soul adding to the growing collection of lost hikers. The thudding she had heard was the sound of countless others, each trying in vain to escape the same fate. Emily turned back, but the mirror had disappeared, leaving only the pristine, empty cabin behind. She was now a part of the forest's dark secret, forever echoing the same hopeless thudding she had once heard. In the years that followed, hikers would sometimes hear faint, rhythmic thudding from the depths of the forest, the haunting of Elmcrest Farm. Elmcrest Farm had always been a quaint, picturesque property nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont. Its weathered barn, old farmhouse, and sprawling fields seemed straight out of a pastoral painting. But beneath its idyllic exterior lay a dark history, one of disappearances, strange occurrences, and chilling legends. When investigative journalist Laura and her camera operator Ethan decided to spend a weekend at Elmcrest Farm, they were driven by a mixture of curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth behind the farm's unsettling reputation. Armed with cameras, EVP recorders, and a mix of skepticism and excitement, they arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. The farm appeared peaceful as they approached, but a sense of foreboding hung in the air. The farmhouse, though charming, had an air of abandonment. The barn, with its broken windows and sagging roof, loomed ominously in the distance. "This place is beautiful, but it's definitely got an eerie vibe," Laura said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Let's set up and see what we can find." They set up their equipment in the farmhouse, placing cameras in strategic locations and starting their EVP sessions. The house, though old and dusty, seemed quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant call of a lone crow. As evening fell, the atmosphere in the farmhouse grew heavy. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the once quiet house seemed to come alive with distant, indistinct murmurs. Laura and Ethan conducted several EVP sessions asking questions about the farm's history and any spirits that might be present. Around midnight, the murmurs coalesced into a clear message on their recorders. The past cannot be buried. Find the key. Laura looked at Ethan, her brow furrowed. The key? What could that mean? Ethan shrugged. Let's see if we can find anything unusual around here. They began to search the farmhouse more thoroughly. In the attic, they discovered a small hidden door behind a stack of old trunks. The door was locked, but a rusty key found among the trunks fit perfectly. The door creaked open to reveal a dusty, cluttered room. Inside, they found old photographs, faded letters, and a large, ornate mirror covered in cobwebs. The mirror's frame was intricately carved with strange symbols that matched the patterns seen in some of the old letters. Ethan noticed a peculiar, almost imperceptible inscription on the mirror's glass. It looks like there's something written here, Ethan said, shining a flashlight on the inscription, but I can't make it out. Laura carefully cleaned the mirror's surface, revealing the inscription. The past haunts the present. The truth lies within the reflection. As they pondered the inscription, the temperature in the attic dropped suddenly, and a cold wind seemed to blow through the room. The air grew heavier, and the murmurs became louder, forming incoherent whispers. Laura felt a shiver run down her spine. It seems like the mirror is important. Maybe it's connected to whatever's happening here. They examined the mirror more closely, finding that it had a hidden compartment in the back. Inside, they discovered a small, leather-bound journal and a series of old keys, each one marked with a different symbol. The journal belonged to Clara Elm, the original owner of the farm. The entries described her growing fear of something she could not understand. One entry read, "The mirror holds the key to the past. The truth is reflected there, but it will reveal itself only when the house is whole." Laura and Ethan were puzzled but continued their investigation. As they moved to the barn, the whispers grew louder and more urgent. They found a hidden trapdoor beneath a pile of old hay. The trapdoor led to a dark, cramped cellar beneath the barn. The cellar was filled with old farming equipment and dusty crates. In one corner, they found a large wooden box marked with the same symbols as the keys they had found. The box was locked, but one of the keys fit perfectly. Inside the box were old documents and photographs revealing a tragic history of the farm. Lost children, mysterious deaths, and a family torn apart by a series of unexplained events. The final document was a handwritten letter from Clara Elm, detailing her discovery of a hidden room within the farmhouse where she had hidden the truth. Laura and Ethan returned to the farmhouse and searched for the hidden room mentioned in the letter. After hours of searching, they discovered a concealed door behind a bookshelf in the library. The hidden room was a small, dimly lit space filled with old furniture and artifacts. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust. As Laura approached the mirror, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. Laura wiped the dust from the mirror, revealing an old, familiar face, the face of Clara Elm, staring back at them with a mournful expression. The mirror seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the room was filled with a cold, oppressive presence. Suddenly, the mirror's surface rippled, and a spectral figure emerged. Clara Elm's ghostly form appeared before them, her expression one of sorrow and relief. The whispers faded, replaced by Clara's clear, mournful voice. "Thank you for finding the truth. The past has haunted this place for too long. Now it can finally rest." As Clara's apparition faded, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house seemed to return to its quiet, tranquil state. Laura and Ethan quickly gathered their equipment and left the farm, their hearts racing with the intensity of their experience. The next morning, the farmhouse stood as it always had, silent and serene. Laura and Ethan's footage showed only static and faint, distorted voices. The mirror, the key, and the journal remained as relics of a dark past that had finally been laid to rest. Elmcrest Farm stood as a reminder of the shadows that linger in the past and the power of uncovering the truth to bring peace to restless spirits. Its fields and barn continued to bear witness to the echoes of history, but the haunting presence had been finally dispelled. Hash, the lantern of Harlan's Hollow. Lena had always been drawn to the Appalachian Trail, seeking its rugged beauty and tranquil isolation. But her latest hike was more than just a getaway. It was a quest. She was searching for the elusive Lantern of Harlan's Hollow, a mythical artifact rumored to possess eerie powers. According to local legend, the lantern was lost in the deep woods of Harlan's Hollow, an area shrouded in mystery and fear. The day Lena arrived at the trailhead, the sun was just beginning its descent, casting long shadows over the forest. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, and the dense canopy overhead created a cathedral of darkness. Lena adjusted her backpack and began her hike, determined to reach Harlan's Hollow before nightfall. As evening approached, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the forest in a ghostly haze. Lena's progress slowed as the trail became less defined, and the dim light of dusk gave way to near-total darkness. She relied on her flashlight to navigate, its beam cutting through the fog like a knife. Despite her apprehension, she pressed on, driven by the thrill of the hunt. Hours later, Lena stumbled into a small clearing. At its center was an old weathered stone well, its mouth shrouded in darkness. The fog seemed thicker here, almost as if it were being drawn to the well. She knew she had to be close. Local lore said the lantern was hidden somewhere nearby, and the well was often mentioned in the tales. As Lena approached the well, she noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and a faint, flickering light seemed to emanate from the depths. She peered down into the well, but the fog made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. Determined, she tied a rope to a nearby tree and lowered herself into the well. The descent was slow and eerie. The walls of the well were lined with damp, slimy stones, and the darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides. After what felt like an eternity, Lena's feet touched solid ground. She shone her flashlight around, revealing a narrow passage leading away from the well. The passage was tight and winding, its walls slick with moisture. Lena's flashlight revealed strange symbols etched into the stone, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and decay. Lena's footsteps echoed off the walls, amplifying the silence that surrounded her. After navigating the labyrinthine passage, she emerged into a cavern. The cavern was vast and eerily still, illuminated only by the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi growing on the walls. At the cavern's center was a pedestal, and on it rested the lantern. It was an antique oil lamp with intricate carvings of dark, twisted figures, and it glowed with a haunting, pale light. Excitement surged through Lena as she approached the lantern. She reached out to grab it, but just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the cavern. "Beware, seeker of the lantern. The price of discovery is steep." Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She glanced around, but the cavern remained empty except for the pedestal and the lantern. Ignoring the warning, Lena picked up the lantern. Its light grew brighter, casting eerie shadows on the cavern walls. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Lena's breath formed visible puffs of mist. She felt a strange pull toward the entrance of the cavern, as if the lantern were guiding her. As she made her way back through the passage, the symbols on the walls began to glow with an unsettling intensity. The passage seemed longer and more twisted than before, as if the tunnel itself was shifting to trap her. Lena's flashlight flickered ominously, and the fog outside seemed to have thickened into an impenetrable wall. When she finally emerged from the well, the world outside had changed. The fog was no longer a gentle haze, but a dense, swirling vortex that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The forest was eerily silent, and the trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Lena tried to find her way back to the trailhead, but the forest paths were unfamiliar and hostile. The lantern's light seemed to attract the fog, making it even more difficult to see. The shadows around her grew darker and more menacing, and the air was filled with a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions. Desperate, Lena turned to the lantern, hoping it would guide her to safety. But as she held it up, she noticed something horrifying. The light from the lantern was reflecting off the fog in a way that created strange, shifting images. ghostly figures moving in the periphery of her vision. They seemed to be reaching out, trying to grab her, their faces twisted in silent screams. Lena realized with growing terror that the lantern was not a guide, but a beacon, drawing something malevolent to her. The growls grew louder, and the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating her with their presence. In a final act of desperation, Lena threw the lantern into the fog and ran. She stumbled through the forest, driven only by the primal instinct to escape. The fog seemed to part just enough for her to find the trailhead, but the lantern's glow continued to haunt her, flickering in the distance like a cruel taunt. When Lena finally reached her car, she looked back one last time. The fog had dissipated, but the forest was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. She could not shake the feeling that something had followed her, that the lantern had unleashed something dark and relentless. Months later, local hikers reported seeing a strange flickering light in the forest, accompanied by eerie whispers and unsettling shadows. Some claimed to have seen a figure, a lone hiker, wandering the trails, carrying an antique lantern. Those who ventured too close to the light would hear the ominous growl of the forest, and the fog would close in, swallowing them whole. The lantern of Harlan's Hollow remains lost, its power undiminished. Legends say it still waits in the depths of the cavern, waiting for the next seeker to uncover its secrets and pay the price for their discovery. The Haunting of Blackwood Ridge. Blackwood Ridge was a place of untamed wilderness, known for its dense forests and treacherous terrain. To most, it was an unremarkable stretch of land, but for those who lived near it, it was a place of deep-seated fear and whispered legends. Stories of disappearances and strange occurrences were common, and one particular tale stood out, a tale of an old cabin that was said to be cursed. Evan, a seasoned hiker with a penchant for folklore, was drawn to Blackwood Ridge by these very stories. He had spent years researching the legends, and now he was determined to uncover the truth behind the cursed cabin. Equipped with his hiking gear, a compass, and a well-worn map, Evan set out on a crisp autumn morning, eager to solve the mystery. The forest was alive with the sounds of fall, leaves crunching underfoot, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the rustling of animals hidden in the underbrush. Evan followed a faint trail that led him deeper into the woods. As the hours passed and the sun began to set, the light filtering through the trees cast eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The trail grew fainter as he ventured further, and soon he found himself at the edge of a clearing. There, half hidden by the encroaching forest, stood the old cabin. Its wood was weathered and decayed, with parts of the roof caved in and windows shattered. The air around it felt colder, and a heavy, oppressive silence hung over the place. Evan approached cautiously, his curiosity battling with a growing sense of unease. The cabin's door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. He shone his flashlight around, illuminating cobwebs and dust-covered furniture. There was a strange feeling in the air, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. In the center of the room was an old, rotting table with a faded journal resting on it. Evan picked up the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. As he flipped through it, he saw entries detailing the lives of the cabin's last inhabitants, a family that had moved there many years ago. The entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with frantic scrawls about strange noises, shadowy figures, and a growing sense of dread. The final entry was particularly unsettling. The shadows are closing in. They want us. We're trapped. Evan's unease grew as he read the journal. He decided to spend the night in the cabin, hoping to gather more information. As darkness enveloped the forest, he set up his camping gear in a corner of the cabin and lit a small fire in the stone fireplace. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Around midnight, Evan was awoken by a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. He sat up, straining to hear over the crackling fire. The tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent. It seemed to be coming from the walls or maybe even from beneath the floorboards. Evan's flashlight flickered ominously, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Unable to ignore the sound, Evan grabbed his flashlight and began to investigate. He checked the walls and floor, but found nothing unusual. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, murmuring voice that seemed to come from all around him. Evan's heart raced as he realized that the sound was not just an echo, but something more sinister. He decided to follow the sound, which led him to a small trapdoor in the corner of the cabin. The trapdoor was barely noticeable, covered in grime and cobwebs. With a sense of foreboding, he pried it open and descended a narrow, creaking staircase. The staircase led to a small, dank cellar. The air was cold and damp, and the walls were lined with mold and mildew. In the center of the cellar was an old wooden chest, the source of the tapping. Evan approached it cautiously, his flashlight revealing intricate carvings on the chest's surface. The murmuring voice grew louder as he opened the chest. Inside was a collection of old tattered clothing, a few rusty tools, and a small ornate box. The box was locked, but Evan noticed that it had a peculiar inscription on it. The inscription read, "To release the curse, one must take the place of the lost." With trembling hands, Evan opened the box. Inside was an old, dusty key and a letter written in a shaky hand. The letter detailed the tragic fate of the cabin's last occupants. They had been cursed by an entity they had inadvertently disturbed, an ancient spirit bound to the land. The key, according to the letter, was meant to be used to lock away the entity forever, but the process required a sacrifice, a new occupant to take the place of the cursed family. Evan's blood ran cold as he realized the gravity of the situation. The entity was not just a spirit, but something much darker, a malevolent force that thrived on the fear and despair of those who entered the cabin. He had unwittingly become part of its twisted game. Desperate to escape, Evan raced back up the stairs, but the cellar door was now firmly shut. The shadows in the cabin seemed to come alive, swirling and converging around him. The murmuring voice grew louder, more insistent, and the tapping turned into a relentless pounding. As Evan struggled to free himself, he felt a cold, unseen hand grip his shoulder. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pulsating with a malevolent energy. He fought against the darkness, but it was no use. The entity was closing in, drawing him into its realm. In his final moments, Evan understood the truth. The cabin was a prison, and he was now part of its cursed history. His own voice joined the murmurs, his form becoming just another shadow in the darkness. The next morning, the forest was silent again, with no sign of the intruder who had dared to uncover its secrets. The cursed cabin remains on Blackwood Ridge, a place where shadows and whispers dwell. Those who venture too close may hear the faint tapping of Evan's desperate attempts to escape.